Was that enough chocolate for you? We have a lot of chocoholics in this group. We hope you're happy. I have a letter to read, little tribute. Because I couldn't come to this tribute to Gay, I felt I had to tell you about how, unknown to me, he got me into the newsroom. I had come to the Times after a 2-year hitch in the Army during the Cold War, where I was a writer for my Army Division's newspaper. The Times didn't give me a writing job, but instead put me on a 3-man team that looked after the needs of the editorial page writers on the 10th floor. We ran errands, carried their copy to the newsroom. At that time, people like me were allowed to offer pieces to the editorial section without a byline. I had written a piece about kids who, having no access to a real field, learned their baseball on city streets. Gay Talese, who was a reporter at that time for the sports section, read my article. He liked it enough to suggest that the sports editor hire me. The editor didn't have a place on his staff, but Gay didn't give up and went down to the newsroom to suggest that they hire me. They did, and my real life began. There aren't too many people like Gay Talese. He is gifted, and his work will always be relevant, remembered, and recognized. Congratulations, Gay. Sid Shanberg. Well, we're here at the real fun part of the evening, and it occurred to me that I'm not really the best person here to introduce Gay Talese to you. Better ask someone who was back at the Times then. And you know, we have a lot of distinguished members of this organization. And this one is a distinguished member of the Silurians who himself won one of our top awards, the Peter Kiss Award, given not only for excellent writing and reporting, but also for mentoring others, for being a really great guy. I'm speaking of Robert Bob Lipsyte, a longtime sports reporter and columnist for the New York Times, a former ombudsman for ESPN. Bob was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Commentary in 1992, and he won Columbia University's Meyer Berger Award for Distinguished Reporting in 1966 and again in 1996. Nice spread there. Author of 20 books, including the recent memoir, An Accidental Sports Writer, co-author of Dick Gregory's autobiography, and the best-selling young adult novel, The Contender. You saw him on television in CBS's Sunday Morning with Charles Kuralt, the weekly PBS show Life Part 2, and the nightly public affairs show The 11th Hour, for which he won an Emmy. Lipsyte cited Gay Talese in his book, An Accidental Sports Writer, as a major influence upon him, called Talese his idol, showing the style that would make him the most influential of the so-called new journalists of the 60s. But I'm going to let him tell you about it. Bob?
Whoever she was talking about, I'll take it. As a Times copy boy in the late 1950s, I learned the essentials of journalism: precision, shoe leather, persuasion, before I ever wrote a single story. I learned them from Gay Talese. Well, actually, I learned them from fetching cocoa for Gay Talese. He often pulled night rewrite in sports, and he didn't drink coffee or tea. He would say, "I don't want hot chocolate, Bob. That's powder and water." I want cocoa cooked with milk. And this is how you tell them to cook it. He was very particular in his instructions. You know, he kind of wrote the same way, slowly, precisely, he says painfully. He would say later that writing was like passing kidney stones. Although it certainly never read that way. Well, most delis around Times Square just wouldn't make cocoa. And those that would wouldn't do it every time, and always required a great deal of begging. But I was on a mission because I knew that I could stand at Gay's desk while he drank his cocoa, and he would listen to my complaints, give me advice, actually read my stories, and encourage me to use the slack periods in my late shifts as copy boy to rummage in the morgue for ideas and to make long-distance calls on Times telephones. He also taught me, and others, I was not the only one, he was extremely generous with his time, how to be open to the half-hidden and the unexpected, then string those pearls of detail into elegant loops, as he did. Gay's choice of story, the forgotten, the the ignored, the losers, was the closest a newspaper writer could come to being Steinbeck or Hemingway or Chekhov, my youthful literary heroes. Gay merged the grand sweep of fiction and journalism, little facts, to tell true short stories and later nonfiction novels. Starting as a sports reporter, Gay turned the so-called old gray lady into Technicolor. I still remember a lead from 1958 about an aging boxer. Quote, "Some old men will attribute their longevity to anything from clean living to shredded marijuana. But Billy Ray accredits his long life to street fighting, prize fighting, and women." Now, 57 years later, the utter banality of that lead attests to just how many of us slavishly imitated its details and cadences. But in 1958, it was totally revolutionary. Shredded marijuana, women, the New York Times. This was all really new. Gay was modern and funny without ever being snide. How did he ever get people to talk to him like that? The old cranks on the desk, are some of them here? No. The old cranks on the desk thought he made up his facts and his quotes. They couldn't quite appreciate Gay then. He was too glamorous, too handsome, too friendly. Nothing changes. He had to be some entitled Upper East Side preppy snot. Gay grew up above his father's tailor shop in a resort town on the New Jersey shore. He only got into the University of Alabama because of strings pulled by one of his father's customers. He was a distractible student. He was always looking for things that the rest of us missed. We cocoa-bearing acolytes were in mourning and in celebration when Gay, a former copy boy, by the way, when Gay left the Times in 1965 to become Gay Talese. In some ways, we felt he took all of us with him. By then, Gay was also showing the work ethic and the stylishness that would make him, as Betsy told us, the most influential of the so-called new journalists of the 60s. He would write for Esquire, what is considered the quintessential celebrity magazine profile. Frank Sinatra Has a Cold. And such bestsellers as The Kingdom and the Power, about the times, Honor Thy Father, about a mafia family, perhaps the first book, I think, to look at gangsters as human beings, and Thy Neighbor's Wife, a controversial book about the sexual revolution that nailed Gay's reputation as a participatory journalist. What Gay thought was critical to his success was his civility. He knew how to treat customers, subjects. He grew up in a retail store, after all, and drove the family's dry cleaning truck. But I think the most powerful lessons he taught us, is still teaching us, were about dedication to craft, about close observation, and about casual bravery. Gay always took chances. He was willing to try and to fail with difficult subjects, which is particularly brave for somebody who writes as slowly as he does. And he maintained, I think, an almost lunatic confidence that he could walk up to anyone and get them to talk to him. And that hasn't changed at all, for those of you who are here tonight. 50 years ago, Gay was a seasoned reporter of 33. Wow. Gay was a seasoned reporter of 33, a member of the Times team that covered Bloody Sunday at Selma, Alabama's Edmund Pettus Bridge, a milestone in the civil rights struggle. 8 months ago, a seasoned reporter of 83, Gay returned to Selma and the bridge to report for the Times in prose just as clear, with details as precise, with that lunatic confidence rewarded once again that everyone will talk to him, and gave us a wonderful story. But this time, he was able to add the experience earned in a lifetime of achievement. He was able to write, quote, "What you see in Selma, like most places in America, is a process still painfully working itself out. No wonder we are so proud to honor our witness, our mentor, Gay Talese. On behalf of the Silurians, our president, Betsy Ashton.
Stay up here, stay up here. You are very lucky because Gay Talese has agreed to share some thoughts with you and then to take questions from the audience. The microphone, I hope, is in the hands of Mike Candell. Do you have it? Okay. But first, I would like to read to you it's beautiful plaque with the Silurians medal on it. And it says, "The Society of the Silurians Lifetime Achievement Award presented to Gay Talese. In newspapers, magazines, and books, he introduced a new narrative voice to the craft of reporting, becoming a major influence on generations of journalists. November 17th, 2005, Congratulations.
Thank you very, very much, Betsy. And the rest of you, I am very gratified to be here, standing in to try to suffice the reputation bestowed upon me by my friend Bob Lipsyte. And I also want to thank the other chronicler of my life, Mort Scheinman. Those of you who have the article at your table know that he said in this article that's very flattering how the best years of my life were the years when I was a reporter. And it's very true. When I was a reporter, the city room of the New York Times was a very large place occupied by about 300 different people at different desks. And what was wonderful about being a reporter on the New York Times is on many days, many of us had no assignment at all. So we'd linger among one another in this noisy place with the telephones and the typewriters that had bells, and we would talk to one another. We would complain to one another. We were all young. We were between 23 and 33, and we all had a common enemy, which was the desk and the bad editing that we know ruined our leads and clipped our prose, and our masterpieces were not appreciated by management. But what it really was, as we talked then, as I'm not sure they talk today in this time of cubicles and quietude and people behind laptops looking down, they didn't have today, I think, what we had then, which was the city room as a therapy center. Because during all that time, the 10 years that I most remember, I was always in the New York office. And I never had, even in my worst days, much depression that lasted long, because sooner or later during that day, I'd talk to somebody, talk my problems out, and in turn listen to other people. And we were one another's psychiatrists. And I lasted there for 10 years, indeed the happy 10 years of my life. And when I left, one of the bills I incurred was psychiatry. I had spent more money on shrinks since I left the Times than the foreign rights of my best-selling newspaper article. But also, I believe I was destined to be a journalist, because I was born, as Bob said, in Ocean City, New Jersey. But what he did not say is the home I had and the store where my mother and father had both a dress business on one side and a tailor shop on the other. It was once a newspaper building. In Ocean City, which is 10 miles south of Atlantic City, during the 1920s, there were two weekly newspapers. One was the Ocean City Sentinel, and the other was the Ocean City Ledger. In the 1930s, during the Depression, the Ledger went under, merged to the paper that's there today, the Ocean City Sentinel Ledger, a paper I worked for in high school as a high school reporter on student news. But when my father, a tailor, saw this big building on the main street of town, unoccupied for 3 years, owned by a bank, was very, very able to buy it, and he did. And we moved in. When I was born in this place that had once been the Ocean City Ledger, and a large building it was. On one side, the tailor shop that was mentioned, on the other side, my mother's dress shop. And upstairs, where there had once been linotype machines, was where we lived as a family. I was not a very good student, as I think has been mentioned, but the only thing I was really good at was curiosity. And that really was born of being a boy in the store. As a boy in the store, from the age 11, I helped out after school, after parochial school, and I would help my mother in her dress shop by putting tissue paper in the boxes, and sometimes going out and fetching tea for her favorite customers in the afternoon. And I learned from her, because she was such a curious person, the art of listening. She was born in Brooklyn of Italian parentage, worked after high school for 4 years in Abraham and Strauss department store in Brooklyn, and she met my father at an Italian wedding in Brooklyn in 1928. This was the wedding where my mother's sister, Sue, was marrying a man named Nick Pileggi. Nick Pileggi is my father's cousin, both of them born in Calabria, which is the southern point of Italy. Nick Pileggi's father was a communist. My father was not quite a fascist, but pretty right-wing. And there are these two sisters, Catherine DiPaolo, my mother, and Susan DiPaolo, the sister. Susan DiPaolo would be the mother of Nick Pileggi, who later on would marry Nora Ephron, and stayed married for 23 years. But at this marriage, this became the meeting place of my parents. And after this Brooklyn wedding, my mother she was told she quit the store, the Abraham and Strauss store, and went with my father, and that's when he bought the paper and put in a dress shop. I was born in 1932, and for the next, till I got out of high school, I worked after school in the store. And what I learned, as any good journalist must know, is from my parents how to treat people properly. Bob Lipsyte made reference to that. I think you learn as a boy in the store something about being comfortable with strangers. Very important. People would come in, mostly on my mother's side of the building on a dress shop, middle-aged women with means, with deep pockets. They were the wives of the prominent people of the town, the wife of the superintendent of schools, the mayor's wife, the Cadillac dealer's wife. People who were a little bit hefty and didn't spend time at the beach during the summer. It was a summer resort, and rather strolled along the main street, Asbury Avenue, which was named after one of the ministers of the Methodist community, which Ocean City was governed by. No liquor to this day is sold in that town. But my mother had these customers, and she was curious about America and these women who were old-line Americans, many of them born in the main line of Philadelphia and settled in Ocean City. She would learn, my mother would, about what more privileged people were like, what they were thinking. And this was during the war years, too. And there was a lot of emphasis on rationing and then. And I was getting, as an eavesdropping kid, not much taller than the cases of the store, learning about storytelling. Because these women were storytellers. My mother was drawing out of them these stories. And I came to see these women as chroniclers of the town, not short story people, but people that short story writers could make stories out of. On the other side, my father, craftsman, like a good journalist, did everything to a certain perfection or aspiration for perfection, if not always successful. So I learned the value of labor properly achieved, a hope that what he did with his suits, what I could do with my journalism, which is to write something of lasting interest that was structured, perfectly fitted, and looked good. As was mentioned also by this great man, Mr. Lipsyte, I went to Alabama because I could not get into another college. My father's affiliation with and friendship with Dr. Crow, who was the leading surgeon in our town, born in Birmingham, graduated from the University of Alabama Medical School, settled in Ocean City during the Depression, and when my father lamented how I couldn't get into college, I tried 7 or 8 colleges in the area, including Rutgers, which was the first to turn me down. The Dr. Crow said, "Oh, Joe, I can get gay in Alabama." Neither my father nor I knew where Alabama was, but it would have me, and that's what I most liked about it. It would have me. And so my mother and father drove me one afternoon in September of 49, to Philadelphia to take a train. It took 17 hours to go from Philadelphia to Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And that began 4 other wonderful years. As an Italian-American, especially during World War II, I always was, in my own head at least, an outsider. Again, not bad to be a journalist and an outsider, because that's the perfect composure for, I think, a curious man. And also, one can see more than one side of a story. I had a really complicated life during the World War II years, because my father, the only immigrant who came from Italy, had two brothers who were in the Italian army. So as a schoolboy, sometimes going to the movies with my classmates on Saturday, I'd see during the March of Time, this was before television, but the news was, and I'd see these Italian soldiers losing in the war, being hauled onto trucks and driven away in the dust. And I thought I'd be seeing my uncles, my father's brothers, one of these times. I thought they were very much likely to be, and they were, POWs during the war. So the war to me, as an outsider in this Protestant town of Ocean City, New Jersey, was another way of getting a different view of an international event, the war. Seeing it through the small lens of a boy above a store whose father was gracious and patriotic in the daytime, but once the store was closed at night, 7 o'clock, mother and father would be upstairs, he listening to the war news, and both lamenting or being very concerned about the invasion by the Allies in 1943 and 44 through the very village my father came from and my mother's ancestors were also from. So I could see and recognize in myself a defensiveness. For people who are defensive or shy and curious, journalism is the perfect occupation. I went to Alabama, graduated as a student in journalism, worked on this college newspaper as I worked on the Ocean City Sentinel-Ledger, the merged paper, when I was in high school. And I made a fortunate connection with a fellow student who was at Alabama during the 4 years I was. He was from Mississippi, a little place called Ackerman, Mississippi. And when I was graduating, about to graduate, in June of 1953, this fellow, Jimmy Pinkston was his name, he said, "Gay, you ever get to New York, you ought to look up my cousin." "Oh, who's your cousin?" Jimmy said, "He's the managing editor of the New York Times. His name is Turner College. He's related on my mother's side." Wow. So after I graduated and settled for a little while with my parents, I took a bus. It was in June of 1953, a month after graduation. Took a bus to New York, 43rd Street, walked across from the bus station to the New York Times building at 229 West 43rd. Third floor was the newsroom, so I took the elevator up. I was dressed as I'd always been as a child. I was dressed well, three-piece suit, hat. Didn't look like some bum off Times Square. I was 21. Approached the reception room. On the walls were portraits of the Sulzberger family and Adolf Ochs, whose daughter married into the Sulzbergers. And as you know, that family is in its fourth generation of owning and running the New York Times. I approached the desk, receptionist man with a white-haired man with a bow tie sitting behind this big desk, looked at me. "May I help you, young man?" "Yes, sir. I'm here to see Mr. Catledge, the managing editor." He looked at me and how I was dressed, but also I was young and I had no appointment. And he said, "Mr. Catledge is a very busy man." "Yes, I know, sir." He said, "Why are you here?" I said, "I know his cousin." "You know his cousin?" "Yes, I went to the University of Alabama, and his cousin and I were in class together." And they're so confused. He picked up the phone, and he made a phone call. About 5 minutes later, a younger man, but very well dressed as well. People in those days in newspapers were very well dressed, as you are here tonight, of course. And this younger man says, "My name is Herbert Andre, and I'm the executive secretary of the managing editor. How may I help you?" I said, "Well, I was told by Mr. Catledge's cousin, if I ever was in New York, just stop by and see him. I'm a graduate of the University of Alabama School of Journalism." And he said, "How long will you be in New York?" I said, "Until I can see Mr. Catledge." And he looked at his watch. This was about 11 o'clock in the morning. I took the 8 o'clock bus from Atlantic City, 3 hours up the driveway to New York. And he said, Mr. Talese has a 4 o'clock meeting with his editors every day. If you will come back around 10:04, I can maybe get you to come in and see him and you shake hands. But you can't be long. No, sir, I won't. Okay, you come back. So I had never been to New York before. I wandered around Times Square and killed 4 or 5 hours. No, 3 hours. So promptly at about 10 minutes to 4, I returned to the reception room, 3rd floor, and the same receptionist was there, looked at me, called up God. Then Mr. Andre comes out of the newsroom, the swinging doors out of the newsroom into the reception room. Say, please follow me, Mr. Talese. Thank you, Mr. Andre. He walks me into the newsroom. I followed, and I saw that glamorous place where row upon row, you could see the whole, there's a block long, 43rd Street, and you could see 44th Street overlooking Sardi's. And in this row upon row upon row of desks with people, men and women, smoking, typing with a bell. Every time the carriage hit the bell, there was noise, telephones. People were in all postures of professionalism. Busy copy readers, office boys, elderly editors, rows of rewrite bank, and the reporters, men and women of all kinds of specialty and general assignments as well. I'm then led by Mr. Andre into this big office. Looked like the size of a basketball court. And in the back of it, first in the front was the big reception room, and that's where the editors would meet with Mr. Talese for the daily meeting and judging the news. And I saw, as they entered the room, at the far, far back of the room, behind a big desk, with one black shiny shoe on the desk, as they leaned back, this guy in a gray pinstripe suit. I'll never forget the look of that suit. And the hair and the face that looked like some Swedish massager had just gave him a rosy look. And he watched me as I walked in behind his secretary. He looked up and says, oh, good afternoon. And Mr. Andre said, this is young Mr. Talese. He's visiting today from, where are you from? Ocean City, New Jersey. Yes, Ocean City, New Jersey. And Mr. Talese said, well, what brings you to town? I said, well, I came at the request of your cousin. My cousin? Who, might I ask, is my cousin? Oh, I said, Jimmy Pinkston. There was on his face not a look of recognition. And I stood there in silence. And Mr. Andre said nothing. He was standing over me. And also noticed that 1 or 2 editors were lined up out the door about to come in for the big meeting around the conference table. And finally, Catlett said, well, and Andre looked at his watch. Mr. Talese said, well, what do you want to do? I said, I want to be a reporter. I want to work for the Times. Oh, he said, we have people here who have experience. They work on daily newspapers for years. You're not experienced. I said, maybe I could be an office boy, copy boy. There was a pause. Catlett looked up at Herb Andre, who was still standing over, and I was seated. Herb, he said, do we have any? No, sorry, Mr. Catlett, you're real full. Finally, Catlett said, look, Mr. Andre will get your name and phone number. And if anything happens, anything opens up, we'll let you know. Oh, I said, thank you, Mr. Catlett, and thank you, Mr. Andre. And I was escorted out, past the reception desk, down the elevator, over to the Port Authority bus station, 3-hour ride back to Ocean City. Thinking, that goddamn Jimmy Pinkston, what a fraud, what embarrassing, what a terrible thing. 2 weeks later, in my mother's dress shop, there's a phone call. Gay Talese there. My mother hands me, Gay Talese, right here. Gay, you have a phone call from New York. Oh, I'm on the phone. I'm Mr. Andre, remember? Yes, sir. Well, when do you think we have an opening? When do you think you can begin a job as a copy boy? I said, today, I'll come down. No, you don't have to come today. Why don't you come 2 weeks from now? Oh, okay, Mr. Andre. So 2 weeks after, I'm packing my little suitcase, and I'm going to New York, and I rented an apartment on West 12th Street, a furnished room, and I began my career as a copy boy. And I thought years later, why did I get a job as a copy boy? Not because I knew Jimmy Pinkston, his cousin. I thought probably because my father's tailoring helped me. Making a fine appearance. The Italian phrase is bella figura. Maybe that was it. Well, maybe it wasn't it, but it began my career. It began the happiest time of my life. Thank you. Now, Myron Candell will have questions. Thank you.
I'm Mike Candell, and I think I go back with this guy longer than anybody in this room. We were copy boys 60 years ago. Now, Gay became a reporter after being a copy boy. I only became a copy editor. But we were still friends. And Gay was a great reporter. And one day, the New York Times, powers that be, spring training, baseball spring training was about to start. And they said, instead of sending the old-timers to cover baseball training, why don't we send some bright young guys? And there were two of them. Gay was one of them. And he went to spring training. There's a point at the end of this talk. Gay went to spring training and was a wow. He wrote things about spring training that the old codgers had never thought of. And he came back, and he really, I think, made his reputation then, at the beginning. And I said to him, Gay, you didn't know anything about baseball. How could you do so well? And he said, don't let him know it. Now, here's the question. What advice do you have to people in your shoes? You're given an assignment. You're not particularly expert on that subject. How did you do it?
Well, I think first you have to have a manner that will instill in the confidence of the person you're trying to know a feeling that you can be trusted. I think, without belaboring the point of how important store manners to me were as a boy, and incidentally, Charlie Rose, I've discussed this before, Charlie Rose was also raised in a store, and he has a genteel manner, as you know, from the show. And my boss at the New York Times, my boss, the managing editor of a later period named Clifton Daniel, best known perhaps for marrying the President Truman's daughter, Margaret, but he was a very refined person. He told me he grew up in a drugstore somewhere in North Carolina, a little town in North Carolina.
Called Zebulon.
Zebulon. Of course, good manners are not always mandatory. Look at Breslin, the worst guy in the world. Did pretty well. I mean, but I not the worst guy in the world, but the most ill-mannered guy in the world. Good journalist. I once said of Jimmy Breslin, hard-working, hard to know, hard to like. But I think that when I started as a sports writer, and Bob was also began his distinguished career as a sports writer, what we learned as sports writers was the life of the underclass. See, so much of journalism deals with success. People in general news, political news, financial news, are people of achievement and power. And the New York Times and other major newspapers deal with power, but not on the sports page. The sports page is really about, with few exceptions, the underclass and those who have achieved through very hard work whatever distinction they got. And that's why I first became so fond of journalism, because I could see through my access to sports people, boxers, baseball players, even if I didn't know the sport that well, they were people, after all, and they had stories to tell. And if they didn't do well, it was a tragedy, because if they didn't do well, they struck out too much, lost too many fights, they'd lose their livelihood. This was serious business. And you also couldn't cover up if you're an athlete. Whatever you did was done in public. You couldn't blame it on the public relations firm if you lost a fight. You couldn't blame it on the economy if you went broke. It was all on, as I think A.J. Liebling said once about how, in his book, The Sweet Science, how these people in sports, especially boxing, were, if they lost everything. It's tragic in many cases. But what are we talking about? What's the question? Let's have a question. Let's have another question. Frank DiGiacomo, ask me a question.
So let's talk new journalism, so-called. Isn't it Truman Capote who claims the mantle, claims the discovery of new journalism? And I know that you also are associated with new journalism, so...
Well, I didn't claim anything. I didn't think I was doing anything new. Maybe Capote thought he was. There were so many good writers that I knew about when I started. There was Lillian Ross at The New Yorker, John McPhee, also at The New Yorker. The New Yorker had the best nonfiction writers. When I was growing up, I read fiction writers because I didn't think there were many good nonfiction writers, because until I got to New York and read The New Yorker, for example, I was reading the Saturday Evening Post and Collier's and Look and Life and not finding much in the way of nonfiction that appealed to me. I was really getting my inspiration from the short story writers. The beginning, of course, with Guy de Maupassant, who my father had a collection of short stories. I just loved them as a high school kid. Later on, I came to know the short stories of John O'Hara, and my favorite, Irwin Shaw, and Carson McCullers, and John Cheever. And I wanted to write, as a journalist, short stories with real names and verifiable facts. That's where I didn't know if it was new or not, and I didn't care. But what I wanted to do, as best I could, was to be a storyteller, but not use my imagination. Instead of the imagination, I wanted to know my people, my subject, and the atmosphere around my subject so well that it would seem as if it's fiction, but it wasn't. It was, as was said before, the result of legwork and effort and perseverance and patience and affection, too, for your subject. You can't, I never wrote about anybody I didn't respect, and I've written about some pornographic, gangsterish, I mean, I read some really low-level characters, but I had respect in a certain way for them, or I wouldn't bother writing about them, because writing, as it has been said so often, is hard for me, and I'm not going to waste my time writing a hatchet job on anybody. But what I do feel today, nobody asked me this question, so I ask myself this question. What's the difference between the journalism that I practice with some of the people in the room? Many people worked when I did. And what do I see in this new generation, some 3 generations from when I worked? I think one thing, the journalist today is very well educated. We were not, in my time, when I started in the 1950s. Most of the people who were copy boys with me and later young reporters with me in the sports department as well, the general news department, were the first of our generation and our families who went to college. We were the underclass, and we had, without being cynical about it or overly disaffecting about it, we had a sense of being outside looking in, a certain skepticism, especially toward power, because so many of our parents, our Jewish parents, our Italian parents, our Irish parents, our African-American parents, were abused by power and didn't have much to say at that generation about their circumstances. And we, the offspring of such people, had, because of our association with journalism, we had the right to write without any kind of coercion or censorship about what we saw. But what we saw, we journalists of that generation, of which I'm a part, much that we didn't like. The next generation and the generation followed, as I said, were far better educated, and also, more important, were not separate from the ruling classes or the powerful classes or the landowning classes or whatever the ruling factor may be. In terms of generation and education, they're the same. They went to school, to good private schools, elite colleges that were also at the same time where the Secretary of State would go, where the CEO of some automobile company would go. They were colleagues of a certain class that exists today. And what did that mean? I think it meant, in a social sense, a kind of comfort with one another, a kind of association, socially, economically, educationally, that blurred the line between what had been the outsider class of which I'm a part, and those who had a sense of belonging. This is not a good thing if you're covering our government. If we had people with less a sense of belonging, we would have had more skepticism in the lead up to the war in Iraq, the invasion in 2003, asking tough questions. How do we believe these weapons of mass destruction that we're being told by the Pentagon? And we would have had some demand for answers and not believe, as the gullible journalists in that period did believe, that the war was justified because of these so-called weapons of mass destruction. When I was when I was a young journalist, we had great foreign correspondents. I was never a foreign correspondent. We had people like, on the Times, we had people like Harrison Salisbury, who was one of my heroes. I wrote a long profile in Esquire about him, and also much about him in my book about the Times, The Kingdom of Power. Salisbury found a way during 1966-67 to get into Hanoi during the Vietnam War and tell the story from the other side, how bombings that we in Washington denied, hitting hospitals, schools, etc. We really were doing that, and Salisbury exposed that in front-page articles in the New York Times, which earned him the rancor of many people who didn't like people who undermined or disagreed with the policies of the government. Younger guy, one of my friends, David Halberstam. I mean, there's a guy that was this tradition of Salisbury, and Neil Sheehan among them. Those guys really called it right when we were saying, and Lyndon Johnson was saying, we're winning the war in Vietnam. And no, we're not winning the war. Halberstam. But both President Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson very mad at him. Kennedy went to the New York Times and tried to get Halberstam off the assignment in Saigon. We don't have anybody like that now. And then lead into the war in Iraq. Where are the Salisburys? Where are the Halberstams? Where are the Neil Sheehans? None of them. Because I believe they became, in so many cases, did become embedded. Troops were embedded, television, newspaper, New York Times included, traveling with the armed forces and armored personnel carriers and tanks, becoming mascots for the military. This is what happened. And this is what I do not applaud. And I do not say that journalism does not have a future, because it has a future. But it will have a future more solvent than we sometimes think today, because we're very uncertain about print, the future of print. But I think newspapers will survive if they give to the people what the people need and cannot get anywhere else. Yesterday, from Paris, we're hearing all these stories. Not the first tragedy that we through in the world of terrorism. God, we had our own here in 2001. But what bothers me about the reporting this week, as well as the reporting in earlier years, is we don't have a sense of who the enemy is. You look in the newspapers, yesterday's paper, today's paper, you find even the identity of the adversarial relationship we have with terrorism. They call it, it's ISIS or ISIS or they don't even have the names of who these people are. We've been hearing Taliban and Al-Qaeda and all these so-called militant. They're people, and we don't know, and I still don't know to my satisfaction, what kind of people would kill themselves because they are so disenchanted with their life and the world around them. They would take their own lives in great numbers. What are they so angry about? What are we doing? There's a quote today in the New York Times, I think it's today, one of the persons that was killed in Paris, one of the terrorists in Paris, 21-year-old guy, who I think set off an explosion in a McDonald's place in Paris near the stadium. The quote today, I'm not sure I have it right, but something like, "We did this because our people, our citizens, are being invaded and killed." He's talking about us. I mean, from his point of view, we are the enemy, we are the terrorists. And you know, when I was young and went to Paris in the 1950s in Europe, we Americans were loved. All over the world, we were the triumphant people of World War II. All people respected us. But now it's not true. In my very senior years, my country is not loved. Even though we are surely doing something wrong, we don't really, as reporters, address it. We're so in support, especially in the aftermath of 9/11, we're so worried, I think, as journalists as well as others, of seeming to be unpatriotic. And what the world, what I think 9/11 really did was a great disservice to journalism, because it restricted our sense of criticism. We couldn't criticize because, after all, we're worried about terrorism and our government protects us, just like those soldiers, those journalists that got in these weapons, or these tanks in Iraq, and they were embedded and they owed their lives to these soldiers. And that's we were on the wrong side as journalists of the war, because we should never be embedded. We should be critical of the government, critical of the army, and question the strategy. This is too long a speech, but I'm sorry. That's the way I feel. Thank you. I think we better go home.
A radical shift. Would you share with us your relation with your family after you started working at the New York Times? What did your mother say when you hung up the phone and said, "I'm going to New York to work for the New York Times"? Did you call your parents when you got your first byline? What happened after that?
Do we have time? Yes, we do. How much time do we have? Anybody has to leave, just go ahead. I was very close to my parents, very close. And of course, my father had read the New York Times in the tailor shop every day during the war. He was interested in foreign news. Of course, his interest centered on the approach of the Allied forces through southern Italy, right into the town where he was born and reared, and where his mother lived and his brothers were in Mussolini's army. So we had an interest in foreign news, and not from a particular patriotic point of view, because I thought as a kid sometimes I was on the wrong side of the war, because I'd see in the bureau of my father's bedroom these two soldiers wearing Italian uniforms. And God, what strange-looking uniforms they are. I cared about clothes, and this is an unusual arrangement of attire. But I had the devotion and support. This is not unusual. Everybody could say the same thing, I think, of my parents. And the fact that I got a job in the New York Times, which is my father's favorite newspaper, made him feel he'd done something right. And he did. Did I answer your question? I think enough. All right.
Okay, hi. First of all, it's fun to see. Can you hear me? Fun to see you outside of a football screening venue, which was nice. But when you were talking about those marvelous stories about interviews with Catledge early on, and then later Clifton, I was reminded of a marvelous scene in The Kingdom and the Power, in which you wrote about Catledge and Clifton Daniel going out to California during a period in which Catledge was really grooming Daniel to be his successor. And at one point, they were at a cocktail lounge or a bar in San Francisco, and they're attracted by a couple of very appealing women, and you sort of get into their thoughts, and then you used a phrase that is absolutely superb. you said both of these men were extremely sophisticated in the arts of relaxation. I have dined out on that phrase over the years, and I've tried most of the time to credit it to you.
Well,
The question I raised to you tonight is, because I've often wondered, was that a reward to Turner Catledge or a payback?
no, my relationship with Turner Catledge and Clifton Daniel, his successor, was always one of gratitude. I was so proud to be on that paper. I believed that it stood for, I believed this, that I remember in my early days, one day I stood in front of the newsroom. I looked around at all these people, hundreds of people, reporters and copy readers and the other factotums and associates. And I thought, in this room, per square yard, there are fewer liars than any room of comparable size in New York. There are fewer liars here than in the political spheres of our country, or the business community, or even the religious community, and certainly the political community. And I thought, how lucky I am to be in a position to be partaking in an occupation that tries to get it right and tries not to support lying. And when we do find liars, and we do have liars in journalism, in my own paper, I guess the most flagrant example would be Jason Blair. And what was great about that story, it wasn't that the Supreme Court or the mayor of New York exposed this. It wasn't anybody that was reprimanded from outside. It was from inside the city room. Inside, the reporters and editors and copy readers did not tolerate it. And what do? They not only got rid of this reporter, Jason Blair, they got rid of the top two editors on the paper. Howell Raines, the executive editor, and Gerald Boyd, the first African-American managing editor, he too got booted. That is what I loved about journalism. It took care of its own, and if you dared deviate from the best policies of the paper, it's your colleagues that are going to drive you out of the temple, and I love that. Ralph Blumenthal.
Okay. You are a famously close reader of the New York Times. I think you probably are as slow a reader of the paper as you are a writer, which is good. I think I read once you spend 4 hours a day reading the New York Times. What do you see today when you read the Times that carefully? How do you compare it to the Times we worked on? What do you think?
The question is, how do I see the Times that I read today compared to when I worked on it? Well, I answered part of that, but I read from page one right through the paper. I also read the Wall Street Journal now too, and I think both are wonderful papers. What I most like about the Times, though, are the writers who specialize in culture. There's one, Anthony Tomasini, writing about music. I just am enthralled with his knowledge. His knowledge, I never finish reading what he writes without admiring and sometimes rereading. I guess I like all the sections with some doubt about the book reviews. And I'll tell you, I must acknowledge that I'm not all forgiving. The other night, I was going to a movie downtown, and I saw a book critic. Oh, I don't know, I guess I should not. I'll mention names, why not? At my age, who cares? I thought Christopher Lamenhaupt was the top book critic in the 1960s and the 70s, I believe. When I published The Kingdom of the Power, you know, in book publishing, there's something called a pub date, and usually the critics wait for that date, and they either praise you or lambaste you. This guy, Lehman Haupt, goes a month before the book is even in the stores. He's tearing it apart. And I read the review. Jesus, there are no other reviews. I called my editor, a guy named just Bob Tannenbaum. I said, Jesus, Bob, this kills our book. He says, Gang, I think you're right. I thought, what helped me? We have here a little savior by the name of Mort Scheinman. He worked for Women's Wear. And there was also a reporter on the New York Post, a columnist, named Murray Kempton. I don't know if any people know. Oh, yeah. Well, Murray Kempton. When Murray Kempton read this Lehman Haupt review, he wrote a column in the New York Post, and Mort Scheinman interviewed me in Women's Wear, where he was the city editor, were you not? And they both took issue with the wisdom of Lehman Haupt, and got me a lot of publicity. And it started a whole controversy. How could the Times do this to its graduate student here? And it started the book as a content and made a bestseller out of it. So I must. But of course, the next time I wrote a book, Lehman Haupt killed me again in the mafia and the dying of his wife and unto the sons. I finally went to Joe Lillyville. I was long gone, but Lillyville was the executor. I said, "Listen, Mr. Lillyville, I don't want this next book to review by Lehman Haupt. I have 4 bad reviews is enough from this one guy." So they gave me to somebody else, and they gave me a bad review there too. So that's that. Listen, I bet people want to go home.
One more question.
One more question, okay.
How would you cover the presidential election and what I regard? How would you cover the presidential election and what I regard as this ongoing war to convince people that the government is the enemy of the middle class and the working class?
I don't think I can give you an intelligent answer to that. One thing I never wanted to be and succeeded in not being was a political reporter. In fact, when I was a reporter, I didn't even want to be on the front page. I thought the trick is to write subjects or to try to choose your subjects and convince the editor there's a story there and make that, whenever possible, a story about a somewhat, if not unknown person, a person that's not newsworthy. I wanted not to write about, when I could avoid it, people who were in the news. My particular ambition was to write stories about people who, were it not for me, those people would not be in the newspaper. And moreover, if I wrote about them well, they would get an obituary because I'd written about them, and otherwise they wouldn't. And it's why my first good story after I left the Times was about an obituary writer called Mr. Bad News, which I think was one of the best things I ever did, much more than Frank Sinatra. But I didn't ever want to be a political reporter, but I was forced to be one for about 4 weeks. I was sent, after I'd been doing feature stories and getting a bit of a reputation, I was sent to Albany. This was somewhere in 1960, and the governor was Nelson Rockefeller. And I hated Albany, and I hated the fact that this way the stories were written from Albany were formulaic. They couldn't write about people. You wrote about, today, 43 bills were passed by the Assembly. And you couldn't tell what was behind every bill, because every bill that's passed or not passed, there's a story. There are people involved in a bill. I never could get to do it that way. We had a policy then in the New York Times that if you wrote a story of 8 paragraphs, 2/3 of a column they call it, you got a byline. If you wrote 7 or 6 or 5, you didn't get a byline. Because I didn't want my byline on these ridiculously stupid stories, I never would write past the 7th. The 7th byline was all over. And they finally caught up to me. And they called me back from Albany, and they put me on obituary writing, which is a terrific job. Because people that you're writing about, and they get an obituary in the Times, they're people of accomplishment. So you're writing about very interesting and achieving people. And I also, during my free time as an obituary writer, I was writing for the New York Times Magazine and Esquire. And so I was making a lot of money from different sources. I think we're about tired here. Thank you.
What an evening. What an evening. Woo! One final thing. Whoa, don't go away, don't go away. One final thing. We honor our speakers with a membership in the Silurians. Here is your membership card. We hope to see you at the next meeting.
I will be here. Thank you.